this video is hopefully a brief check-in. I want to give you some tips and get started on introducing you to the new module. So the first thing I want to do is backtrack a little bit and give you a tip about how to read a source closely, so then when it comes time to write about the source, you have a handle on who wrote it and what you can do with it. If you can take the time to think through who said what and when, it can really improve your writing. You also don't need to take a big chunk of a source. Just take some phrases from someone else's idea, or even repurpose some primary information that they use. So I'm just going to take a look at a couple of articles that we used for our last module and give you some tips, hopefully not too much after the fact, but you'll definitely have a chance to revise any papers that you like for the final portfolio. So I'm just going to go to the last source that we used 2 weeks at Michigan, and I'm going to hopefully, oh, my browser's not going to cut and paste it for me. So let's see if I can just Google it. So, okay, so if you remember this source, 2 weeks at Michigan. So if we were in class, I'd say, hey, is there any clue as to the ethos or authority of the writer here? So we have one clue, pretty big clue. We've got the author's bio. It says James Tobin, an author and historian, is a Michigan alumnus and professor of journalism at Miami of Ohio. And other thing is he contributes regularly to the U of M Heritage website, an online repository of historical sources and images about the University of Michigan. So I would say this is a sign that he's a pretty good expert. So you already read the part of the book from Willis Rudy. So I would say he's on par with Willis Rudy in terms of talking about Michigan, although a newspaper article that's publishing an issue that's just unfolding might not quite have the authority in terms of depth, but I think he's a pretty good source. So I'm going to kind of look at ways that you can use that in a paper. So first of all, I would say to set up the quote, according to historian James Tobin, we know that he's a historian, he's actually a journalism professor too, and quote maybe something he said about what happened. The Spanish flu was spreading fast in military camps where soldiers were sheltered in close quarters or awaited deployment. This was a breeding ground for the spread of the deadly virus. So that's in my own words. You can also extract primary details from this, right? So if you remember, Tobin quoted from Michigan Dailies. So I'm going to go back and I can use what someone said. An editorialist in an October 9th Michigan Daily wrote, apropos of the false alarms which are rampant, there might be suggested a factor which is very potent in warding off the disease. So definitely wordy, kind of 1918 discourse. So Tobin used this to discuss the fact that at the time there was some denial about the severity of the virus and some ignorance too. And then another way that you can just quote from a source is forget the authority of the writer, just use the details or just use the facts, and then do the internal citation. And this is really a way to kind of smooth out your use of primary source material, of just using fragments of someone else's words. And that is a way to show that you've done the reading. It also gives you words, so you're not using all the words yourself. And then also it doesn't clunk it up too much by trying to identify, well, who said that, right? You don't want to always be repeating according to Professor Tobin, right? According to historian Tobin. But using newspaper articles is a little tricky because not all newspaper articles are written by quote-unquote experts. They're written by journalists, and journalists might not know a lot about the topic. So this is no offense to journalists. My father was a journalist, but you might have heard the adage that journalism is history in a hurry. So these two articles that you read were written in March. We might look back on these articles and think, I don't know about that comparison between COVID-19 and the Spanish flu. But at the time, this was trending. So let's see if we can go to this article. Of course, my clicker browser is not working. And go to that source. So this looks very similar to the last article. However, if you try and look for the ethos of Steve Friess, no, you don't really see a bio, blah, there's no blurb about him. And then down at the bottom, you might find something about him. Oh, there it goes. Steve Friess is a news and features editor at Our Magazine. So if you're writing a paper and you said, according to Steve Friess, news editor and features editor at Our Detroit, it might not sound as authoritative as when you're quoting someone who's actually a historian. So I would say when you are writing a paper and you're quoting this particular person, you might want to keep that in mind and borrow information from that author. But maybe you want to use the trick that I just used for Tobin and just pull out some of the facts that he promoted in his article. And then, again, I would say Friess is not a historian, and one of the things he said, I kind of wasn't sure how correct that was. He said that people at the time minimized the flu in the press. However, at the time, there was censorship because of the war, and actually we'll learn a little bit more about that. So I don't know if people were actually minimalizing it or the fact is they just didn't know a lot. So that could be considered some presentist to assume the minimalization of the flu was somehow political like it is now. It was political in a different way. So again, to sum it up, consider the source. So for our next unit, we're going to be looking at, let me get this out of the way. We're going to continue on with the idea of studying college, but we're going to go a little more broad. And so again, I have a guide to the module, which you might have noticed last time. I did have a guide to the module to help you cite sources and internally. This guide is a little rougher, okay? So as we go on, I'm going to kind of take the training wheels off. So I'm not going to go back to the last module too thoroughly, but just to let you know that in the module, I try and give you some clues to, everything that we're using and links to the books that they're from, because getting these PDFs from books really decontextualizes the information. So try to contextualize it a little bit for you, and then break it down in terms of what's primary sources and what's secondary sources. Okay, so where'd the module go? Uh-oh, I froze it up. Okay, so there we go, our SATC model. Okay, so you've already read the college life lecture, okay, and that's just brief overview of the history of how colleges grew. Some things might surprise you. Women were actually going to college, maybe differently than men. Some of them were going to land-grant institutions because the land-grant institutions were established, a curriculum was established to train farmers, and then they thought, wait a minute, what about the women? So then they were training quote-unquote homemakers, so that's where you had home economics, which women really actually use that to their advantage, and a lot of expertise of so-called homemaking, such as design, such as the chemistry of food. Also, a lot of women went to teachers' colleges. So the University of Michigan at the time was one of the biggest colleges, and it was not unique, but I think it was one of the few colleges that allowed women to come, and they had some flexibility in what they wanted to study. And in the very beginning of the university, when they brought women in, women were represented in the professional schools. So we're going to go broad, and we're going to look more at the development of the modern college student, how colleges were created, how sports got integrated with college. What does football have to do with going into a lecture to learn? And then we'll also see what happened to John Price, whether you care or not. But we do sort of see what happened after the Spanish flu and how college developed. So that's a broad picture. We're going to be looking at that broadly. And then we're also going to look specifically at women, and then even more specifically as a case study, women at Michigan. So this module is different than the last module. it's kind of all over the place a little bit. You're going to have a lot of choices about what to write about. Also, one of our featured sources is a diary of Josephine Goldman. So she was a student in between 1911 and 1913, or maybe 1910 and 1913, and she put herself through college, and she really struggled. So her experience, I think, really juxtaposes John Price's experience. However, keeping in mind that John Price was a second-generation college student and Josephine Goldman was a first-generation college student. So John Price's father and his uncles, they worked their way through college. They actually had scholarships. So we can kind of see the cycle and the continuation, and also college as a form of mobility. I also have photos of Goldman's life, which I'll show you, or you can look at on your own to give you a sense of what University of Michigan was like at the time. And then we're also going to be looking at a Michigan Women Alumni Survey of women who were at Michigan at the time. There's also a larger database called the Heritage Project, which I'm not going to assign you, but you can consult it for your paper. So the paper topic I will go over again next week. You're going to have more time to work on it, but I just want to familiarize you with this module and what we're up to next. Okay, so I would say just keep looking at the discussions. We're going to really break down the paper and the actual topic itself through our discussions like I did last time. So I'm almost finished reading your papers, and overall you did a good job with the hard task, and I threw you in the deep end. Some of you had more experience than others using sources to make an argument. So I'll have your papers returned to you by Friday. I'll also have some global feedback using some examples from other papers, from fellow students' papers. Normally I'll get your papers back to you kind of when I get them, but I didn't want to do that until you kind of had a sense for the criteria and sort of quote unquote what I'm looking for. So look for that video a little bit ahead of time from what I have in the syllabus on Friday, along with receiving your paper. All right, have a good week. Stop in office hours.